And in today's video, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, I don't want to say third spaces, right? But I guess I just kind of wanted to come on and just kind of share something I've observed and just um, what really drives like the comparison, the relational breakdowns, the communal breakdowns, right? The harassment online, the criticism, the judgmentalism, what makes people feel like they have to tear down other people and their choices, what drives the shame, right? In shaming single mothers, you know, and why I think so many people were sort of like spiraling. Now, obviously, we know in a very general sense, right? Like, we are not supposed to be hearing a lot of opinions about a lot of different things from people that we don't know. And I do think at this big grown age, right, I think it takes a level of self-awareness to engage with the internet in a way that is going to be productive for you. And I think if you are someone who is still sort of trying to find your sense of identity, then you're going to feel very shaky online, right? It's going to create this sense of instability because much of what you thought you knew, you're going to realize that people are living lives and have experienced certain outcomes in life, right, that actually aren't so cookie cutter. And so, very generally, I think what this really boils down to is a lack of control. I think for many people, right, and you hear, and I'm going to touch on a few different things I've seen, but I think for some people, you believed, right, or at least when you're young, let me say that, right, when you're young, you believe if you do everything the right way, then life is going to guarantee a very specific outcome. And when you see people who may have done things the right way, or more commonly those who have not done things the right way, right, it's easier to say, okay, right, in my mind, this is why this person, this scenario, this circumstance is the problem, this is avoidable, right? And you kind of see this in the comment sections of may this never find me, right? And really what you just have is a lot of people who are anxious and afraid, right? And I believe that much of this anxiety really begins to swell online because people aren't actually living life, right? Because if you are over the age of 25, right, and you're entering your 30s, right, you're older, you should have experiences and you should be living life to know at this big grown age, right, that much of what we do is out of our control. Like, there's a lot that we cannot control. There's a lot of things that are just imperfect, right? Because life is just not full of guarantees, right? You can, do all things the right way, and it doesn't guarantee that, right? And so instead of us growing wiser and growing in humility and being persons who are more compassionate and who are more humble, right, we grow anxious, right? And we're growing anxious because we're getting older, and there's this level of uncertainty when you're not actually living life and you don't have any experience, right? And so that kind of comes out in this hyper sense of trying to control what other people do, right? And so I just found that to be very interesting. And I think that's something that I've just noticed. And then, conversations about being invisible, right? I was listening to Hidden Brain, and it just talked about the Columbine shooters and, what really takes place in the minds of people who really commit these like horrible crimes in society. And it's really just people feeling invisible, right? And so obviously when you start talking about that on a very micro scale, not, something as serious as someone, organizing a crime to harm, thousands of people, right, or hundreds of people, but persons who, are just not really sure where to go, right? For example, if you build your identity on being beautiful, and then you come into contact with people who are equally or greater, right, in a scale, right, judging by societal standards of beauty, right? If you build it on being smart, right, you then come in contact, right, algorithmically, you're going to come in contact with people who maybe can articulate things better than you can, right? Or if you are a person who obviously, if you were in American society and you were told that you are superior because of your race and the way you look and all these different things, and you start to come into contact with people who are equally or if not greater talented, then people are going to start to spiral, right? So I think what really is taking place today is like this fear, right, and this lack of identity. And I can't tell you what gives you identity, right? Because I have my values and I have my faith. But I will say that I think once you grow and you shift, you learn not to build your sense of identity on these things. And I think this is probably one of the biggest grievances I have about the lack of role models, right? Because as we age, and I'll speak specifically for women, right, it should no longer be about beauty, right? This is why we have the conversations about regression, but it should no longer be about beauty, right? It should be about, okay, this person or this woman specifically, I don't want to say it's crowned, but for lack of better words, right, this level of authority within your community, it comes from wisdom, right? This is a wise woman, this woman, you know what I mean? And instead, you just kind of have people really trying to sustain this beauty that, it's there, but it changes as we get older, right? You're not 21 anymore. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? And so I just think it's very interesting to see. But yeah, I just wanted to come on here and share that because I think that's what's taking place today. I think it's really just a matter of anxiety. I think people have anxiety. And I think people don't really have like a stable foundation. And I think it's hard to build that when you're constantly online and things are constantly changing, and what was cool today is no longer cool tomorrow. Right. And it's not really you, right, who has to do the work of sustaining this identity. Now you have to navigate a world, right, that perceives you in a certain type of way. And that perception is very different than it was 2 years ago, right? And not necessarily because you've aged, but because societal definitions and our, cultural awareness, all of these things have changed, right? And so you're going to feel very unstable. You're going to feel very unstable. So yeah, like I said, I can't tell you what to base your identity on, but I do think that much of what we have today is just a bunch of anxious persons dealing with uncertainty. And I think that comes out in obviously being someone who is more controlling. And so if you see people in their lives and their situations or whatever, and if you can, cast judgment, right, and your judgment is validated, right, then you have a way to sort of like avoid these very oftentimes inevitable, disappointments in life, right? And so if you never deal with the disappointments in life, then you get older, you regress, and you spend your entire life sort of trying to recreate scenarios where there's a different outcome, right? And obviously we know that that's very costly. In a very general sense, you're living backwards. So yeah, it's going to cost you something, right? So yeah, I wanted to come on here and share that because I think we should just have a little bit of awareness of the psychology there. And as we age, we should be more grounded in who we are. We should have an understanding about our limitations, right? What we cannot do, right? What we're capable of, what we're not so capable of, what is possible for us. But I think when you are sort of fed this belief of, limitlessness, right? This sense of invincibility, which obviously does come from our society being heavily influenced by youth. And obviously when you're young, there's life's full of possibilities, right? But as you get older, you try things, you start to realize, I'm not so good at math. I'm not going to be a mathematician, right? Oh, I'm not so good in business, right? I'm not going to be an entrepreneur. Or if I am going to be a business owner, okay, these are my limits, right? I'm not going to be this, person in this, on the more higher scale, right, in terms of business, right? This is going to be my business, it's going to be my small business, it's going to sustain my life, but it's not going to, it's not going to scale in the ways in which, would be extremely lucrative, right, and bringing in an exorbitant amount of money, right? But if you're not living life, then you're not going to have that sort of like reckoning. And I think that's why people kind of fall into like victim mindsets. And I think that's where you see not necessarily Christian nationalism, but I do think you can kind of see that in Christian communities where you have a lot of people who are so eager, right, to have this sense of superiority, right, to have this sense of, mattering, you know what I mean? And if people have been victimized or they do feel victimized, then they are going to start to model this level of like moral superiority. And I think we're also seeing that as well. And I think obviously in that we know that that's very dangerous, right? Because there's the erasure of authenticity. And there's the erasure of like, intuitiveness, right? Like who you are as a person, erasure of personality, right? All these different things when you become someone who's just incredibly rigid and feeling entitled and feeling like you are worthy of more or, deserving of more. And you can do no wrong, right? If you model this righteousness, right? Because you have been victimized, right? And so sometimes you have to be careful with that. If you do possess a victim mentality, that's kind of where you can sort of like find yourself, right? You can find yourself with this attitude, right? And this belief, and maybe it's subconscious, right? Because here's the thing about being a victim. When a person is victimized, I'm weak at this Q&A sticker, but when a person is victimized, they are then given a lot of support, right? And sometimes that support may look a little bit like inadvertent admiration, right? Because it's like, oh my God, poor you, you did the right thing, they may be affirmed in their morality, right? Depending on what act was committed against them. And so in that, if you're then in religious communities, that's then amplified, right? Because now people are also telling you things like you're God's chosen person, right? And I'm not deconstructing faith. I'm just telling you how, depending on where you are, right, in life, the victim, if you're feeling like a victim, and I'm using faith as an example, just how that superiority is then amplified, right? And then how that obviously becomes a problem, right? So yeah, if people are telling you that, you're special, you got some level of admiration from this, then yeah, right? Now you're going to feel like if you're doing all the right things, right, then you're a good person. And it's going to be hard for you to reckon with the fact that maybe you don't make the best decisions, right? Maybe you have hurt other people. So, having a victim mentality is very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. It doesn't matter really what the context is, right? I do believe that people who possess a victim mentality are more likely to be controlling, yes, but I also think that they are more likely to obviously perpetuate harm and, abuse others, quite frankly. So you have to be very mindful of that. So what does it look like, I think, to have this sense of identity and be grounded? Again, personal values, you know what I mean? Personal values, I think it's kind of assessing your life and, the trajectory of your life so far and just kind of what you're into and, again, recognizing your limitations, what you can and cannot do. I think I told you guys that from day one with Renaissance Room. I said, hey, listen, I don't think this podcast is going to scale in that way, right? I don't have the support, the resources, or the bandwidth, right, to really see that through. But I didn't spend my life feeling like, whoa, it's me, right? I didn't spend my life feeling like, oh, people just don't listen to like, I didn't feel that, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think a big thing is just, self-checking. I know people talk about accountability. I don't actually think you can really hold anybody accountable. I think you have to have self-control, quite frankly, to even, you know what I mean? Like if you don't really have that, then like, the rest of what we're talking about and what we're trying to do here is just a waste of time, quite frankly. I don't think you can hold anybody accountable. People don't, like, who are we? You don't have that kind of power. You know what I mean? You don't have that kind of power to, like, change anybody or, like, hold people accountable. I give this example all the time. If someone wants to walk up to you and punch you in the face, like, I mean, was there really anything you could have done to prevent that? You know what I mean? Sure, you can say, well, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have sent at this stop at this time in this place and, all those things. Yeah, sure. But, like, is there really anything you could have done to prevent someone punching you in the face? The answer is no. So anyway, I'm going to go. But that's how social media creates, harassments. That's how it creates unsafe communities. That's how victims and people who possess a victim mentality go on to perpetuate harm onto others. And yeah, and obviously, if you never grow up, then you just become an adult that's entitled, and people are either going to give you what you want, or you're going to become someone who's intolerable, right? You may become manipulative, malicious, right? Parasitic, and you may be normalizing it in the name of friendship, in the name of community, right? In the name of, woe, it's you, right? If you're a victim, right? People who had dreams to go off to the NBA didn't make it. You know what I mean? Then feel entitled to wealth and things like that. And, use proxy, right, to other people to, be sort of like parasitic. It's the same thing with, beautiful women, right? If you feel like you are entitled to a certain lifestyle because you're beautiful and it didn't work out for you and you didn't get that, right, then you're going to, I would imagine, you know what I mean, feel entitled to certain things and, all those things. So I don't know. I don't think that, sometimes I don't feel like speaking reality, like being real, is for the internet. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I think it always comes off wrong. I think it always, Anyway, I'm going to go. I think I've made my point clear. I've kind of veered in this conversation, but I wanted to come on and share. Okay, peace. Bye.